This is the Authentic Change Podcast, and I am Mike Horne. Authenticity reflects what we want from each other and our organizations: open communication, trust, community, fun, and opportunity. I want to help you to do your best in your personal and professional relationships. This podcast delivers expertise, insights, and approaches on authentic leadership, to live your purpose, to lead from your values, to establish connected relationships, to steward people and culture change, to build and sustain prosperity, and to open doors and possibilities. This podcast will assist you in paving the way forward to personal, team, and organizational prosperity. Welcome to the Authentic Change Podcast with Mike Horne. I am delighted and honored today to have as our guest for the listening audience, Norm Jones. Norm is an incredible thought leader in diversity, equity, justice, inclusion, and he's a colleague I met through the Organization Development Network. Norm has been the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at Amherst College. He has been an Associate Chief Diversity Officer and Deputy Director at Harvard University. And he has a lot more in his background. And I'm going to let him tell you about that as he introduces himself. But he also has a new venture, which he's going to talk about towards the end of our podcast, as President and CEO of Integrated Diversity. It's clever. It's idea. I never thought of that. So, Norm, welcome to our podcast. And I'm just, again, so delighted that you're here. How about telling our audience just a little bit about yourself?
Sure. And thanks for having me, Mike. I'm incredibly excited to be here with you. You pretty much covered what's been going on lately. I've been in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space really since about 1998, when I took a position to serve as the special assistant to the superintendent of schools in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And at that time, I wouldn't have described the role as a diversity and equity and inclusion role per se, but in retrospect, working in a school district that was about 80+% students of color, many of whom were on free and reduced lunch, and working, around public policy and things like that, to make sure that kids had access to quality public education. I recognize that I've been working in this space for quite some time. So I've been in higher ed for a number of years and have also enjoyed a really rich career in organization development, really trying to enact change at the systems level. And most recently, I would say that I've really been leaning into justice-based conversations, as many different kinds of organizations try to understand what it means to do anti-racism work in particular.
Oh, there's so much that we could unpack in this relative to integrity and also to the topic of authenticity. But what about these justice-based conversations? I mean, how do you think about either integrity or authenticity relative to the topic of justice, or, some observation or experience you may have had, or some insight you could share?
Sure. I mean, it's interesting, right? Because when I think about the word integrity and the word authenticity, what immediately pops into my mind is the inextricable relationship between the two. And the irony is at play for me in that in the DEI space, often there's this unspoken sort of ordinal relationship between the D and the I and the E. I think most people say DEI because die is not a great look
right.
or sound when we're talking about this work. But there's a way in which diversity as a sort of compositional proposition is often the starting point, right? People want to make commitments to having a certain amount of difference represented in organizational spaces. And that's absolutely important, absolutely critical. And the notion of inclusion really has much more to do with culture and behavior. How do we behave as a result of the diversity, the difference we amass in various spaces? And equity, of course, is much more related to infrastructure and policy and process. But the irony is that when we think about justice, which is often sort of the deepest sort of kind of engagement in the diversity and equity space, I really look at it as sort of a full circle moment, because when we think about the legislative landscape and take sort of an historical perspective around diversity work, it is in fact justice-based movements historically that opened up conversations about the salience of difference in the first place. So in many ways, I think what we see as, progressive work is actually a kind of reconciliation and reckoning of the past. And it describes in many ways the American project, which at the end of the day is a global project. So when I think about integrity, I think about our responsibility to the work of justice as both a starting place as well as a destination, right? You never really arrive, because difference will always be a variable that complicates what it means to be in community with one another. So it really is a container for lifelong learning, lifelong engagement. And the notion of authenticity comes into play when we think about what it means to allow individuals to come into a space bringing their full selves. And when it comes to identity, we all know that systemic and structural inequalities don't really allow for complete authenticity in a variety of ways. And so I love the idea of thinking about integrity and authenticity in relationship to one another.
Right. This, again, like so much to unpack with what you described, and relating it to an American, if not a global project, and certainly, thinking about all of the historical movements in American society, and the impact of race, and the impact on race, of race, for race. So integrity, I'm with you in that regard. I think that integrity is, it's more or less the musical notes of life. Integrity gets tested all the time when you're 10, in your 20s, 40s, 50s. But when we think about it, we usually think about it as a whole cloth. Someone, being of whole cloth. It's who they are. It's maybe the genuine article. So to describe it in terms of this project, which I think is incredibly hopeful and optimistic, which is lovely. That's a very generous sort of view on it, to think about this cloth that is whole yet in development. Yeah, that also turns it into a little bit of a verb. So that's pretty cool, Norm. Appreciate how you think about that. And then just to think about, when I think about authenticity, and I'm with you, it is about the ability to bring who you are to what you do. And I run, a poll quite frequently where I ask people, do you feel you can be more authentic at home or more authentic at work? And inevitably the answer is, well, I can be much more authentic at home than at work. And,
Sure.
I always think as an organizational person, as a leader, as a coach to others, what do we do to bring, to allow that essence, that person to flourish in so many ways? Going back to this full circle you described with justice, it has to start with a certain sense of values, right? Or what do you think? Because I sure have known some authentic jerks.
Absolutely. Who also happen to be leaders. So that becomes interesting.
Yeah, well, they're not leaders, they're managing. They're
okay, fair enough.
Higher paid managers, right? But what do you see in that regard? We, confronting these issues as, I wouldn't say confronting them, exploring them, breaking through them, considering them, all the kinds of things that we think about in terms of human development. Where does the integrity issue arise in individuals? You think about all the, great examples we have of where words haven't matched actions.
Sure. Yeah. Mike, I have to say, I've been certainly accused of giving people a pass all too often, but I think part of the challenge, the complication, the noise in organizations has a lot to do with the fact that there's really no ideal prototype or even common understanding around what it means to operate with integrity or even to operate authentically for that matter in an organization. And I think a lot of that has to do with the concept of organizational culture and who gets to set and shape culture. And when you step into a workspace or even a community space, as opposed to your home environment, I think what kicks in automatically for many people is a need or a compulsion to perform based on one's imagination of what the organizational culture is. And that's why it's so important for DEI practitioners to understand the ways in which this phenomenon is at play. Because if certain individuals have not been allowed access to certain spaces, then the sort of default cognitive position is to try your best to sort of conform to whatever you believe to be the cultural norms in a particular space so that you can participate as fully as possible in the life of the organization, to not be relegated to a singular or even dichotomous identity, but to really be valued as a full participant in the life of that organization. And so the reason I think this has a lot to do with integrity is because leaders with positional power have to recognize that dissonance is at play for individuals in an organization. And I think leaders have a responsibility to sort of grant various kinds of permission for people to show up as authentically as possible in service of transforming organizational culture. And so I don't really think it can be parsed at the individual level, although leaders have a particular responsibility, because organizational cultures sort of precede and in some ways supersede how any individual shows up or sort of embodies the culture of an organization. And that's why looking at the composition of teams is so important, because that sort of concentration and amalgamation of talent is absolutely what helps to transform a culture, what pushes a culture to evolve. And in the DEI space, all too often, what happens is we don't see that as a proactive proposition. And so we wait until the other shoe drops. We wait until there's an event, an incident, either in the organization or out in the world. And then we respond based on the dissonance that's created between what the organization espouses, right, the organizational values, and what is actually happening out in the world. And usually those efforts fail because what gets exposed is the rhetoric of diversity, equity, and inclusion, as opposed to authentic behaviors that have been going on day to day and are actually shaping the culture of an organization.
Sure. So culture is a powerful influence on behavior, right? I mean, that's how others might think about that. I think about it as shape up or ship out. I mean, that's often what happens in organizations. It's often difficult for any one individual to shine in an organization because so little happens individually in organizations. It all starts with some sort of pair or some sort of trio that creates innovation in organizations. But I think a lot of what you described, Norm, comes from a certain set of humanistic values, right? Which is respect, acknowledge the dignity in everything that we see, bring diverse ideas and diverse people around you in order to grow inclusion. A lot of people don't hold those similar values. In their, organizational examples abound. I mean, you can go back into the classic business school cases of Enron and others where integrity was the number one corporate value, and it really didn't mean anything. I mean, you can bring it up a little more to date with Wells Fargo. Didn't really mean anything there. So, how do you sort of, sync that up in your assessment, in your understanding of this, big giant thing called culture that influences behavior and selection and all those kinds of things?
For me, it really does boil down to leadership, authentic leadership. And when authentic in this context doesn't mean, that you sort of hold fast to your values and assert them within the organization, come what may. It means that you work to find the intersection of what you actually care about as an individual leader and what your organization reflects. And there's never going to be 100% alignment there, right? So the opportunity in that situation is for a leader to actually model vulnerability, which I think is an example of integrity, to say that no leader has it right or even partially right when it comes to DEI in particular, because we know that it's an ever evolving sort of set of precepts. And the leader's responsibility in those moments is to be authentically curious about the experiences that individuals in the organization are having relative to their own identities, but also the nature of the work that they're doing. Because as I said before, all too often in the DEI space, leaders engage with individuals in the organization in the context of their identities. And that's not actually why they join the organization, as it turns out. You come to work and to be in community with other workers and to be in thought partnership with other workers. And so the leadership proposition is to use oneself to both elicit more authentic presence in the workplace, but also underscore the salience of identity in that work, right? So if white men I shouldn't say if, the fact that white men hold positional power means that they also have an opportunity to elevate conversations about why compositional diversity has not been in the forefront of our thinking and our conversations when it comes to people who hold leadership positions. Why is that? What is the culture? What sort of toxicity in our organizational cultures prohibit individuals from advancing in the organization? What is the difference between mentoring and sponsorship, and how might leaders use themselves to execute on sponsorship such that you can actually track and measure promotability within an organization? How do you actually take feedback that you get in focus groups and engagement surveys to learn more about individuated experiences relative to identity? I mean, all of those kinds of conversations, I think, rest at the feet of leaders who can either drive an organization forward and truly innovate at these edges, or sort of witness the slow death of an organization as a result of not having these somewhat hard conversations.
Yeah, I mean, I think what causes organizations to expire, to die, to cease, is that they fail to innovate, and therefore they no longer have the stakeholders that are important to them. I mean, that's, I think, more or less what all organizations have in common, is that at some point they expire. Interesting to think about why people join organizations. I mean, having led Great Place to Work campaigns in a few organizations, what I have come to realize is that people aren't really they are attracted, but they don't join an organization because of all of the perks, fringe benefits, extras, maybe not even extras, maybe just fundamentals of doing business in Silicon Valley or in San Francisco. So you really come to think about, the question of why do people join organizations? And often it has nothing to do with all of those benefits, amenities, or other things that you might think of, though they can be an element of attraction. So when I, go back to this issue of authenticity, I think about it as congruency. It's what I say matches what I do. It's my actions and my words match, and even better if my thoughts align. And I think it's, you raise a really interesting issue around the alignment of individual and organizational goals. And do they ever like perfectly align? I don't know. Isn't that the goal?
I do think it's the goal, but I also think
it's a goal that needs to be challenged. I mean, you think about, but you think about, okay, how do individuals really bring all of who they are to what they do so that everyone benefits? How do leaders work in ways that they tell the truth, that they honor those who are present and those who aren't visible, that they keep their commitments, that they act from their heart, that they respect others? I mean, how do we get all of that to happen?
I think there's something that's actually quite artificial about organizational goals, objectives, strategic plans, even mission and vision statements are all too often, I don't know, they're actually more static than we're willing to admit. And so if your North Star is something that's not really all that laudable, let's say, at the end of the day, it's really more fundamental than anything else, then there's something that's going on psychically that actually lulls leaders into the illusion that that you can arrive at a particular destination. And when you arrive there, you recalibrate and you produce another strategic plan or another set of goals. And the reality is that it's much more fluid than that. It's anything but linear, Lord knows. And so that's why I kind of look at this idea of this notion of individual and organizational alignment as more of a daily proposition. It's more of an exchange that requires, as I said before, an authentic curiosity and checking in around the deltas between individual and organizational goals and the extent to which the two are at odds with one another versus, harmonized. And there's a way in which organizations, because of their day-to-day work, one doesn't believe that you can realistically kind of check in or do that kind of monitoring or that kind of evaluation on a daily basis, because we've been socialized to believe that that's macro work, right? That's the kind of stuff you talk about when you go on an annual retreat or a quarterly retreat. When in reality, we actually need to hold ourselves accountable for doing that kind of work on a day-to-day basis. And I think organizations that have found ways to integrate that way of being, that way of thinking, and that way of working into the daily life of the organization are much healthier for it because it allows you to pivot so much faster.
Yeah, I think we're leaving the dominant paradigm of predictability and moving to one of embracing uncertainty. I mean, I think that's the shift that's around. When you're an organization and you want predictability, it's how can I get all of the, Freds, Marys, Janes to conform, right, to a set of performance. And I think in a world where we embrace uncertainty more, it's how do we let the individual flourish and what do we do to create the environment that allows that to happen? Particularly as people shift locations of work, as they think about work differently. It's a challenge that many leaders, I think, will have to embrace, is this ability to hold uncertainty as the dominant paradigm now.
Ironically, I think embracing uncertainty is actually a form of retention. I don't think many people buy the notion that leaders assert their value by putting stakes in the ground or advancing notions of certainty, against a tide that is so clearly uncertain, is so clearly a victim to a macro culture that throws all sorts of things at us, right, that cannot be predicted. And all those dynamics come into the organization every single day. And so to not engage with that inevitability is really tone deaf.
Yeah. And in the face of uncertainty, people do weird things, right? Because they want to close the gap, right, between what I'm experiencing now and what's next. So people, bring fear, they bring anxiety. But I think there are a few leadership actions that, help in that. I mean, if I, in periods of uncertainty, rather than sort of raise my fear, I mean, what I'd rather do is I'd rather, listen to those around me. I'd rather hear their needs. I'd like to act courageously. I'd like to make sure that my behaviors and my actions are linked to my words and ways of thinking. I'd like to respect differences, and I'd want to treat others with, courtesy and dignity. I
Yeah.
mean, that's how I would approach that environment.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I can't help but I'll beat up on HR here for a minute. The reality is that many people who hold uh, positional leadership roles have ascended to those roles not based on any of the things you just listed, Mike, or too few of the sort of attributes you just listed. And so
We have a
there is, in
60-year
fact,
history of promoting people on their technical abilities.
Sure. And
People
so
get
that
promoted
gap,
because
I
they're
think,
likable, they work hard, they've got great technical skills, and
yeah,
it
yeah,
doesn't mean a demonstration of leadership. So, right.
exactly. And so those gaps, I think, they have starker implications for today's organization. And it also, it makes vulnerable the workforce in ways that I don't think organizational cultures are necessarily prepared to handle. Because when we start to look at generational differences, even folks are voting with their feet more and more, not because they believe that they're necessarily, indisposable or anything like that, but because there are different variables that contribute to their bottom line quotient around quality of life. And if individuals experience, too much shame, too much othering, too much marginalization within an organization, they'll go somewhere else, even for less money, even for less this and that. You talked about the perks earlier, because at the end of the day, people have a more holistic frame around what they see as sort of an ideal life, right? Only a part of which is about work.
Yes. I mean, I wrote Integrity by Design with the idea that it's for people who need or want a best friend at work. Based on the Gallup research that when you have a best friend at work, your engagement increases. I think that's so true. When somebody says, "Oh, you've got this, Norm," or "I've got your back," it just changes the way that we can interact and that we can relate to one another. And I think spur innovation, which is the ultimate outcome.
Absolutely. The other thing I'm thinking about, Mike, is the fact that leaders are up against cultures that are so much bigger than their individual identities and are also reflective of societal inequalities, right? And so to kind of default to the notion that an organization is, by virtue of its espoused values, inclusive, pluralistic, positioned to value on a daily basis, critique or constructive feedback or healthy debate between individuals. It's not really the way it works. And so being ever cognizant of the ways in which culture precedes a leader's entree into that environment means that you actually are working each day to kind of dismantle something that was there before you. And even if an individual, is starting an organization, you're still in an overall macro environment that is ridden with various forms of oppression. And that's why I referred at the very beginning of our conversation to the American project, or even the global project, because this sordid history is always with us. And so we have to be really mindful of what that means in the context of building relationships.
Sure. And, maybe as a one last topic for us to explore is this idea of, or the topic of authentic leadership, which you mentioned. When you say that, what do you mean? I mean, what comes to mind for you? I mean, for me, it's built around trust and stewardship and, creating meaningful teams. The ability to engage authentically with others is foundational to the exercise of leadership, and that requires an ability to relate with others. What do you think about all of that?
I agree with all of it. And I also know that the processes underneath each one of those values is a very messy process. And at the end of the day, what we're really talking about when we're talking about the tenets of your book is humanizing the workplace and humanizing relationships, quite frankly. Because notions of imposter syndrome and stereotype threat and all these other well-researched sort of theories are not just theories, they're very real. And so if I don't have assurances that when I engage with someone that they are seeing beyond my identities in many ways, and I don't mean being colorblind or any of that silliness, I really mean getting to the substance of a person beyond sort of artificial or socially constructed identity markers. That's messy work, right? One of the most valuable conversations.
Well, I think all learning is relatively messy.
Yes, but
learning's not easy.
Yeah, but I don't think organizations are socialized to describe it as such.
Oh yeah, I agree.
And so being really transparent about that and talking about what that really looks like on the ground is really critical right now. I wanted to tell a quick story about a meaningful conversation I had with a direct report several years ago. And we were in a one-on-one meeting, a weekly supervisory meeting, and we had done a lot of work together around what it means to manage up. And I wanted this individual to know that you can tell me anything you need or want to tell me about my leadership, as long as it works to strengthen the health of our relationship, because I don't want this to feel like a sort of a one-way street. And what I learned during the course of that conversation was that in a lot of different meetings, this is a woman identified individual who also identifies as white. I learned that I was often sort of stepping over her in conversations, not realizing I was doing so, but in retrospect, I realized that what was at play for me primarily was the topic of race. And so if I was walking into a room of all white people, I was absolutely committed to making sure, especially as the head of a division, that my voice would be heard. And I didn't realize the ways in which I was muting her voice because I wasn't centering gender so much, I was centering race. And so as someone who reported to me, she was constantly faced with this sort of conundrum around what it would mean to assert her gender in a particular context versus assert herself as someone who reported to me, right? As a white woman, I'm a Black man. And so it gets complicated real fast. And if we didn't have the kind of relationship container, I'll call it, that made that really honest conversation possible, number one, I wouldn't have known that this dynamic was at play. And number two, she could have harbored all sorts of feelings and imaginations around our relationship and her credibility in the workplace because of not being able to have this conversation. And so we made a habit actually of in our subsequent one-on-one meetings, actually going through certain meetings and talking about how both of us showed up and talking about the kinds of commitments that we aspire to in the future so that we could do this work, this relationship work in service of the work. And I think that kind of dynamic is really what the work is at the end of the day, because, that goes so far beyond whatever sort of rhetoric we put forth around certain kinds of values, right? So the integrity story in that story I just told you was really about me following through on my commitment to not speak every time I wanted to speak, just because you all need to hear the Black man, and recognizing that that's one of many different variables, different identities, and different considerations that I need to be thinking about as a leader. And she made similar commitments, right? Because she also understood the salience of race for me and my lived experience as the only person of color on a senior team. So these kinds of exchanges and interplays, I think, add to the overall value of an organization at the end of the day.
That's an authentic relationship where you're equally able to deliver the good news and the bad news. the good story and the bad. I mean, or however you want to characterize those. Yeah. The star and the developing area. Yeah, that's great. It's a nice way to
pays
think
dividends
about,
over time.
Right. That sure does. Hey, Norm, just as we begin to wrap up today, if our audience, and I can't imagine why anyone wouldn't want to get in touch with you. I mean, how would people?
I can think of a ton of reasons.
How would people get in touch with you? What are some of the ways for people to contact you?
Email is probably the best way, and I can be reached at norm@integrateddiversity.work. You can find me at Norm Jones on Twitter, and I'm on LinkedIn and all the sort of staple social media sites. But email is best.
Okay, so once again, that's norm@integrateddiversity.work.
Correct.
Okay, Norm, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure to hear your insights. You bring a great perspective on organizations and on how we interact in those organizations and on the topics of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. Thank you so much. It's been so meaningful for me, and I hope for our audience. Stay tuned until the next episode of Authentic Change with Mike Horne. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll subscribe today and tell a friend about our show. If you're looking for hands-on help to increase your success through authentic change, or have a question you'd like to hear me answer here, please email me at mike@mike-horne.com.